Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're peeling back the gilded curtain on the place where dreams are made and, lately, where billions are lost, Hollywood.
That's right.
We are confronting a really serious industry forecast, one that suggests a deep systemic instability, a potential Hollywood recession slated for 2026.
And that is precisely the target of our deep dive today. When analysts talk about a recession in this context, they're moving way beyond just, a typical cyclical slowdown.
Right.
They are describing a fundamental crisis of the business model itself. The sources we've gathered, and we're looking at analysis from a major Hollywood publication, The Wrap, plus some really granular hard data from the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, they paint a remarkably consistent picture.
Which is?
It's an industry where the financial floor is just constantly collapsing, forcing executives to make extremely hard choices about future talent and development.
So our goal today is to connect those dots for you. We need to understand how these two seemingly separate issues, the catastrophic, unstable state of the theatrical box office and this steep reported decline in the representation of women directors are actually deeply and financially interconnected.
The two sides of the same coin.
And they're defining what the industry is reluctantly calling the new normal.
And this convergence leads us right to the core paradox that's driving all the anxiety right now. For every massive success story, the occasional film that just becomes a cultural phenomenon and drives a massive box office boom.
It's like a Barbie or a Top Gun.
Yes,
Maverick.
Exactly. For every one of those, the vast majority of the theatrical ecosystem remains critically diminished. You see the headlines about the occasional hits, but the overall structure that underlying 12-month-a-year business model that used to guarantee consistent returns
is gone.
It's proving fundamentally unsustainable.
And that's the key tension we have to resolve today. How can an industry that still produces billion-dollar movies simultaneously be facing a systemic collapse?
It's all in the math.
Let's dive into the financial mechanism that explains this contradiction, starting with the mathematics of failure.
Okay, so we begin with what the sources are calling the big hit, big flop cycle. This is the central financial, I'd even say pathology of modern Hollywood.
The core of the problem.
The math is just brutal. A few colossal successes, even ones that hit that magic $1 billion mark, are no longer sufficient to sustain the entire financial structure of the global film industry.
Okay, let's unpack that. That sounds counterintuitive. Why isn't $1 billion enough anymore?
Because of the sheer scale of the losses, the sources draw a really direct and powerful analogy to the economics of the comic book industry.
Oh, this is interesting.
They suggest that for every absolute Batman, that one massive cultural or financial hit that carries incredibly high profit margin, there are literally 100 absolute disasters that are massively underperforming.
So in Hollywood's calculus, a single $1 billion movie is now required to offset the cumulative losses of dozens of other films.
Dozens of mid-tier and lower-tier films that just failed to connect with the audience or, couldn't even recoup their P&A costs.
Let's pause on that, P&A prints and advertising. For a listener who might not be immersed in the Hollywood finance lingo, can you explain what that actually entails?
Absolutely. It's often the hidden costs that sink. P&A represents the cost of getting the film into theaters and making sure people actually know it.
So not the movie-making part?
No, not at all. This includes printing the digital copies, paying for the theatrical bookings, but critics the massive cost of global marketing spots, media campaigns, billboards, premiere events, talent.
And for a major blockbuster, what are we talking about cost?
P&A can easily run between $100 million and $150 million, and that's on top of the production.
Okay, so let's do the math. If a mid-tier film, say, with a $70 million production budget, only makes $50 million globally, that $50 million isn't profit.
Not even close.
That $50 million has to first pay the theater's cut, then the studio's cut, and then it's supposed to start covering the P&A. So if the film costs another $80 million just to advertise.
The studio is now down $100 million before they even think about the original production budget.
Wow.
Precisely. And the data confirms that the middle ground has just collapsed. It's not just the bottom tier films flopping. Those reliable $80 million budget, $200 million grossing films that used to pay the rent for the studio,
they're just not hitting.
They're often failing to even reach the $100 million a global mark now, and that means the entire burden of solvency falls onto that 1 in 100 phenomenon. Sources are Hollywood is running an extremely high-stakes gambling operation, not a diversified business.
And this leads us straight into the high-budget conundrum. The financial data we're looking at highlights that budgets are so astronomical now, often creeping past that $200 million mark, that studios misjudged the entire equation.
They absolutely did. They kept associating bigger budgets with guaranteed success.
A principle that, according to these analysts, has proven to be fundamentally untrue.
Completely untrue. The cost of filmmaking has just soared because of inflation, VFX demands, talent salaries. So if you spend $250 million on production,
You need to make, what, double that?
more. You need to make at least $600 million globally just to break. And that's after you factor in all those costs. Distribution fees, the theater's roughly 50% cut of the ticket price, and those massive P&A costs we just talked about.
The terrifying part of that is the profit margin. So if a studio spends $250 and the film performs decently, say it clears that $600 million break-even bar and makes $750.
Their net profit might only be $50 to $75 million.
That's it.
That's it. And that small amount is utterly insufficient to cover the $400 or $500 million they lost on the 3 other failed high-budget blockbusters they released that same quarter.
It's an unsustainable model. It just can't work long-term.
And the industry was clinging desperately to the hope that 2025, a year free of major production strikes and fully clear of pandemic restrictions, would finally establish a stable, profitable, new benchmark.
A new norm.
The sources indicate that this expectation was profoundly misplaced. The inconsistent status quo remains. Cultural phenomena can still happen, but the overall theatrical ecosystem remains diminished. And that truly healthy, consistent 12-month-a-year flow of profitable films seems perpetually out of.
Let's ground this in the historical figures the sources reference, because that scale of erosion is crucial for you to grasp. The stable, good years were pre-pandemic. 2017 saw $11 billion in box office totals.
2018 hit a high of $11.8 billion. 2019 was still strong at 11.3. That was the last sustainable era.
Before everything changed.
And then the collapse. 2020 and 2021 combined saw those totals plummet to just $2 billion.
And while the pandemic is the clear culprit for that immediate drop, the critical insight the sources provide is about the recovery, or lack thereof.
Exactly. Even as 2023 and 2024 figures have risen, for example, the sources note 2024 figures are only up about 1% over 2023. Despite some big potential hits on the calendar, those figures are deeply.
Because of inflation.
Because of inflation. That's the real stip.
So if we adjust those high watermark years, say, that $11.8 billion from 2018 for today's dollar, what does that translate to?
The sources highlight that factoring in the cost of tickets, concessions, and just overall purchasing power change, that $11.8 billion from 2018 would equate to roughly $15 billion in 2024.
Okay, so that's the real benchmark, $15 billion.
Exactly. So if the industry is pulling in, let's say, $10 billion in 2024, that's not a return to 2017 level. That means they are operating at a $5 billion shortfall compared to where they should be, simply in terms of real purchasing power and attendance.
So fewer people are going.
Fewer people are going, and the nominal dollar count is just masking a profound loss of actual market share.
This inconsistency and these diminishing real-term returns have a direct and painful impact on the exhibition side, the movie theaters themselves.
They're the real victims in this scenario.
The sources detail the theater's survival strategy, noting that rising operating costs, particularly labor and utilities, combined with these inconsistent returns, are forcing underperforming theaters to shutter for good.
And quickly.
And this leads us to that incredible, bizarre nugget from the sources, the popcorn bucket economy.
It sounds like a joke, but it's a critical revenue stream. The sources are citing the high-margin revenue generated specifically from novelty merchandise, things like the highly priced, sometimes $80 or $100 collectible Fantastic Four popcorn bucket, as a key factor keeping many struggling theaters.
I find this absolutely fascinating. It suggests the financial transaction has fundamentally inverted. The primary product is the movie ticket, but the actual profit driver is now the secondary luxury good.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Can we dive deeper into the margins on that?
Certainly. When you buy a $15 ticket, roughly half of that goes directly back to the studio for distribution. The theater makes, optimistically, $750, and that has to cover all their operating costs.
Right.
But if you spend $80 on a limited edition plastic bucket, the cost of manufacturing that bucket is probably less than $10.
So the profit margin is huge.
Potentially 80 or 90%. That is pure high margin revenue that the theater tirelessly.
So a theater would need to sell, maybe 12 to 15 full-price tickets just to generate the same net profit as selling one of those popcorn buckets.
It's a specialized form of merchandising that's acting as a life raft. Yes. The sources specifically compare it to how high-margin collectibles, like Funko Pops, sustained many physical comic shops during their leanest years.
But the fundamental question raised by the analysts is, how long can this last?
Exactly. How long can theaters survive by relying on niche, high-margin novelty sales rather than consistent mass-market ticket revenue? If the actual movie-going experience is only an accessory to buying the collectible, The core business model isn't just broke.
It's inverted.
It's completely inverted.
And as the theaters are barely hanging on by selling plastic movie props, a massive tectonic threat looms over the entire distribution landscape, the merger threat.
This is the big one.
The word circulating in the industry, and detailed in the Wrap's analysis, is that Netflix is likely to purchase Warner Bros.
This potential acquisition is the crisis that could absolutely trigger that 2026 recession. The sources suggest the likelihood is increasing because Warner Bros. Is said to be actively rejecting the counteroffer from Paramount,
Which signals they're looking for a much bigger deal.
a deal of immense scale. And if Netflix, a behemoth streaming-first entity, acquires a powerhouse studio like Warner Bros., a studio that relies heavily on traditional theatrical distribution for its DC, Harry Potter, and other major IP, it could lead to even greater, perhaps fatal, destabilization of the traditional role.
Because Netflix's business model is completely antithetical to the theater model.
Completely.
If they acquire Warner Bros., why would they prioritize a theatrical release that requires an expensive P&A push when they could simply debut every film on their streaming platform to drive up subscriptions?
They wouldn't. It completely de-emphasizes the cinema experience entirely. Theatrical releases would become, at best, mere marketing events to drive traffic, eliminating that crucial 90-day window that theaters rely on to survive.
And this isn't just about one studio changing hands.
No, it signals the potential end of the traditional theatrical system as we know it, hence the severity of that 2026 recession forecast tied potential merger.
So how did Hollywood paint itself into this corner? We have to look back at the immediate aftermath of the pandemic downturn.
The panic period.
That period where studios made what our sources now characterize as reactionary and ultimately self-destructive decisions that are now creating this long-term financial pain.
The sources analyzed two key damaging lessons that emerged really rapidly during the height of 2020 and 2021. The first lesson was a fundamental shift in consumer behavior.
Right.
Audiences forced to stay home and presented with excellent at-home viewing options learned they don't have to see every movie in theaters immediately. That cherished habit of routine Friday night theatrical attendance was fundamentally broken for a huge swath of the population.
And the studio's response to that broken habit just made the problem worse. That's the second mismanaged lesson.
The studios panicked. They universally pivoted to streaming services to offset those immediate theatrical losses. They took films originally slated for theaters and pushed everyone onto their newly launched or heavily invested in streaming platforms like HBO Max Plus.
Which seemed like a good idea at the time to get some revenue in the door.
It was a short-term financial fix that created long-term system. By putting high-quality theatrical caliber content directly on platforms, often at the same time as the theatrical, they essentially trained the audience to expect that level of content home.
They undermine the very scarcity and urgency that drives people.
Why rush out and spend $15 on a ticket and $40 on concessions when you know it will be on your $15 a month subscription service in 45 days or even less?
It's the erosion of perceived value. They normalize the idea that the theater is optional rather than essential.
And that post-COVID problem is traceable directly to the studio's reactive decisions made during sacrificing future stability for immediate subscribers.
And this legacy of, well, self-sabotage leads us directly to the broken franchise problem. Even those massive tentpole franchises, the established IP that Hollywood relied on as guaranteed cash cow, are no longer reliable earners. High-budget sequels and reboots are consistently failing to deliver.
Which is terrifying for them.
But why? If the IP is beloved Star Wars, Marvel, DC, various legacy titles, why are these projects failing? The sources suggest the breakdown is systemic and tied to a decade of what they describe as activism-focused entertainment and filmmaking by committee.
Right, and the argument presented in the source material here is highly critical. We need to be clear about that.
Yes, we're reporting on their analysis.
They suggest that many movies were being made, in part, to hit certain non-creative benchmarks, leading to creative incoherence or being driven by a desire to fundamentally alter the established IP. This, they argue, resulted in poor performance and rapidly damaged audience trust.
The specific critique is that if audiences perceive a sequel or reboot as fundamentally misunderstanding, disrespecting, or radically changing the core appeal of the property,
they will simply exercise their new post-pandemic choice. They won't show up in theaters, they'll just wait, or skip it entirely.
And this erosion of trust is directly quantifiable in the financial losses we were just talking about.
Absolutely. When you combine massive, out-of-control budgets with creative mismanagement, or what the sources call bonehead decisions that prioritize a narrow agenda over mass appeal, you create a cycle of mounting existential losses.
The sources suggest that studios, particularly from the mid-2010s up until the pandemic, were perhaps overeager to greenlight projects because they were following perceived social trends or, as they put it, were hot to hire diverse people.
And in doing so, they sometimes prioritize those factors over the specific experience required for a $200 million film. So when those high-risk, high-budget projects failed to deliver high-quality crowd films,
The resulting financial losses became too large.
way too large.
And that ultimately impacts you, the learner. As a consumer, the studio choices failing to produce high-quality, crowd-pleasing theatrical releases and then damaging the long-term value of their own IP directly impacts the quality and availability of what you can see.
If studios can't monetize these films in theaters, they push them directly to streaming platforms, which, by the way, are themselves struggling to become reliably profitable.
Essentially, the high-risk gamble to studios means the theatrical experience is now reliant on novelty, popcorn buckets, and old movie reruns because the new content often cannot stand on its own financial feet.
And this financial instability, this executive fear, has immediate, measurable, and profound effects on who gets hired in Hollywood. Which brings us to the second major crisis highlighted in our source.
The steep drop in the percentage of women.
Yes!
Okay, before we dive into this data, we have to take a moment to frame this discussion correctly for you. The data and the subsequent critique we are about to present are highly charged. Our role is strictly to report impartially on the finding, and crucially on the executive perceptions detailed in the source material, which are, in turn, driving real-world studio behavior. We are not endorsing any specific political or creative viewpoint, but rather analyzing the stated financial rationale behind these severe personnel shifts.
Absolutely. We are analyzing a reaction to a perceived financial crisis. The crucial figures come from the USC Annenberg inclusion. The sources reveal that the percentage of women directors helming the 100 top-grossing film dropped steeply to just 8.1%.
8.1%. To put that in raw numbers, that means only 9 women out of 111 directors were involved in those top projects.
Just not.
That 8.1% figure is staggering. It represents a massive decline from the previous year, 2024, when the percentage was 13.4%.
That is a roughly 40% decrease year over year. I mean, that is a brutal, violent contraction in opportunity.
What stands out in Dr. Stacy Smith's research, which is cited in the sources, is the timing of this drop.
Right.
She is noted as saying that these changes are not the result of immediate political shifts or external DEI prohibitions that have been in the news.
So it's not a reaction to current.
In reality, the results are driven by executive greenlight and hiring decisions that were made long before any of those prohibitions took effect, decisions made in the 2 to 3 years immediately following that initial post-pandemic.
So the sources are suggesting this decline is a direct corporate react, driven by financial fear and a perception of creative failures that cost studios massive sums of money.
It's an internal backlash, not an external one, if you follow the study's timing.
Well,
that's correct.
We can see a snapshot of where women directors are still finding some footing in the list of the 9 films cited in that 2020.
Yes, the list includes Freakier Friday, a sequel that reportedly made money, Five Nights at Freddy's 2, Doishi, Elio, which the sources pointedly called a financial disaster.
A disaster. Celine Song's Materialists, which is a smaller acclaimed film. Jennifer Caton Robinson's I Know What You Did Last Summer. Maggie Kang's K-pop Demon Hunters, which reportedly kicked ass and was a surprise hit.
Hi.
Hikari's Rental Family, and previous Oscar winner Chloé Zhao for Ham.
Looking at that list, you have a mix of massive sequels, indie films, and animation. But the drop in the overall numbers is what fuels the central controversial theory presented in the source material.
And this is where we have to look at the highly critical argument on performance and qualification.
Let's be very careful here.
The controversial theory presented is that this steep drop is directly linked to the perception, again, the perception, that directors hired for specific perceived reasons, and the sources specifically mention DEI reasons, particularly on massive blockbuster films, subsequently underperformed either creatively or financially.
And this is cited as causing massive financial loss, which then triggered a subsequent, almost blanket prejudice across the industry.
This is what they call the double-edged sword of DEI, which requires careful parsing. The logic, according to the source, is rooted entirely in financial.
Okay, so break that down.
First, executive risk. People were fast-tracked into massive, high-pressure projects where they maybe lacked the specific large-scale IP. Second, when those projects failed critically or financially, they resulted in massive loss, sometimes hundreds of millions.
And the third step is the financial consequence of that failure.
Yeah. Because studios cannot afford those mistakes anymore, the inevitable negative consequence is that when the next person of a similar background comes along, who may be genuinely highly qualified for the job, they get unfairly turned down around because assumptions have been made based on prior high-profile financial failures.
The risk tolerance has just plummeted to zero.
It's gone.
Let's illustrate this with the specific case studies in blockbuster mismanagement cited by the sources, as they perfectly frame this phenomenon. We start with Chloé Zhao.
She is seen as the archetype. She moved from critically acclaimed independent work like the Oscar-winning Nomadland to directing the massive Marvel blockbuster Eternals.
And Eternals was widely criticized in the source material as a major financial and critical failure for Marvel.
The core argument is that her acclaimed independent style of directing, which excels in nuanced character-driven work and smaller naturalistic scope, did not translate effectively to the demands of a $200 million visual effects-driven tentpole.
The sources question the initial hiring choice itself. Why put a director known for quiet, atmospheric realism onto a massive, studio-mandated spectacle?
The implication being that the studio prioritized the director's profile or her previous critical success over her proven track record of handling massive special effects-driven IP.
And the result was an expensive miss.
Exactly. The source material suggests the studio took a calculated, high-risk gamble that did not pay off, leading to a massive loss for the company. The exact scenario executives are now trying desperately to avoid by returning to proven safe hands.
Then we have Greta Gerwig, who presents a creative paradox.
Yeah.
The sources cite her as the female equivalent of Rian Johnson.
Meaning a director who has undeniable success in her own field, but is seen as being prone to radically altering established IP when given control over legacy franchise.
While her film Barbie was a huge financial success, it cleared the billion-dollar mark, which few films ever do. The sources heavily criticized it as a feminist agenda film, arguing that the creative focus overshadowed the core appeal of the toy property for many audiences.
And this is a crucial question because if it made $1 billion, how can the sources call it failure or a risk? Isn't financial success the ultimate justification?
That's what I was going to ask.
The sources reconcile it by focusing on future risk. They expressed really strong concerns about her stated intentions for the Narnia adaptation she is working on for Netflix.
Ah, I see.
The commentary specifically predicts that this adaptation will be a disaster due to her stated desire to change everything about it, fundamentally altering the religious and allegorical elements she established.
So the critique isn't about Barbie's performance. It's about the precedent, Gerwig's stated creative intentions set for the management of other cherished IP.
Precisely. They're seeing a pattern where creative ambition overrides what they see as the required respect for established IP, leading to audience alienation down the line, regardless of the initial tell.
So the fear is that directors, and it's regardless of gender, given the comparison to Rian Johnson, who fundamentally seek to change the core elements of a beloved universe rather than just telling a good story within that universe, are ultimately harming the IP's longevity and audience trust.
Which justifies future risk aversion in the minds of executives.
And finally, Patty Jenkins is used as a prime example of the high-risk gamble and the swift financial consequence that follows.
She had the monumental success of the first Wonder Woman, a cultural and financial smash.
But was then heavily criticized for the quality of Wonder Woman 84, which the sources bluntly described as a piece of shit.
And the failure of Wonder Woman 84 was extremely high profile. It cost Warner Bros. Dearly and forced them into that complex decision about its immediate streaming. The outcome of that high profile flop was immediate and
She was reportedly booted off of Rogue Squadron,
which is now apparently being reworked into Starfighter Squadron. This just reinforces the idea that in a financially precarious industry, even a director with one previous smash hit cannot withstand a single high-profile failure.
One major flop is enough for studios to immediately pull the plug
and revert to known, financially reliable quantity.
That's why the discussion around these contrarian successes is so vital, because it challenges the narrative that studios are reverting to known quantities based purely on performance.
Right.
The sources highlight women directors who have found crowd-pleasing, consistent success in established IP, but who have not been given equivalent blockbuster opportunities.
We're talking specifically about Deborah Chow and Bryce Dallas Howard for their directing work on various episodes of The Mandalorian. Their episodes were consistently cited as high-quality, crowd-pleasing, and crucially respectful and effective of the Star Wars universe and its established aesthetic. They demonstrated the ability to manage large-scale effects and deliver content that satisfied a demanding fan base.
So the logical question raised by the sources is sharp.
Yeah.
If these women can kick ass on established IP on the small screen, successfully navigating the politics and the creative demand of a major studio franchise,
why aren't they being given the $200 million picture up. Why is the studio going external for the next big Star?
The sources suggest studios are bypassing proven talent that demonstrates the capacity to handle large-scale IP effective without inserting unnecessary creative deviation.
In favor of male directors and massive theatrical hit. The argument is that the current fear is so intense that executives are only willing to bet on the absolute safest, most established commodities, even if it means ignoring proven effective who happen to be women.
Given the scale of the financial losses and the resulting systemic instability, the industry is quickly moving toward a strict, risk-averse strategy.
It's all about mitigation.
The immediate fallout is a shift toward returning to proven hitmakers, reinforcing the cycle we just described.
Studio executives are reportedly adopting a lean and mean strategy driven by the memory of those massive post-pandemic losses. They are on the record stating they cannot afford to risk giving $200 million to a new person simply because they hit the right checkbox or whatever.
The sources believe those days of high-risk, unproven bets are unequivocally over. They're done. The concrete example of this strategy is the shift on that Rogue Squadron project. The original director, Patty Jenkins, was slated to direct it. Now it's being reworked into Starfighter Squadron.
And the person reportedly helming it is Sean Levy, the director of...
Levy is seen as a director with recent, massive, indisputable financial success. Deadpool, Wolverine, Stranger Things, Free Guy.
This move is a textbook example of prioritizing box office security above all else. The studio is literally substituting a high-risk Jenkins coming off a flop with a high-security name, Levy coming off a massive hit to reassure investors and the public.
And this leads us to the strategic shift to risk mitigation, which is the optimal business strategy proposed by the sources to get out of this big hit, big flop cycle.
The core idea is simple, but it requires a massive change in executive culture. Stop associating bigger budgets with guarantees.
Which is a revolutionary thought for Hollywood.
It really is. The industry has learned the hard way that high spending does not mitigate risk, exponentially exacerbates it. They need to deleverage. So instead of spending a hypothetical $500 million on a single film that might flop,
putting the entire annual budget in one volatile basket,
the strategic alternative is to divide that money.
But how does that division look in practice?
The proposal is to spend $50 to $75 million on multiple, independent, or new projects, perhaps 3 or 4 major ones, or as many as 10. The key is to manage the risk individual projects.
So a $50 million film needs to make, what, around 120 globally to break even?
Something like that, which is an entirely different, far more achievable threshold than the $600 million threshold of a $250 million block.
And this approach inherently mitigates potential loss. If one $50 million film flops and loses the entire budget, the studio isn't crippled.
But if you bet on multiple projects, you significantly increase the chance of a surprise. You get something like The First Joker, which was a relatively smaller budget film that just bloated into $1 billion.
Proving that high budget is not necessary for high return.
And this strategic shift also provides a crucial answer to the crisis we talked about in section. The sources suggest if studios genuinely want to diversify their talent pool and promote new voices, stick those directors on the $50 million pictures first.
It's a lower risk environment where they can prove their ability to manage a budget and deliver a strong, profitable film
without the immense pressure of a $250 million franchise tentpole.
So it shifts the focus back to performance within a financially viable scope. If any director proves they can manage budget, deliver on time, and create a crowd pleaser for $50 million.
That performance earns them the right to helm a bigger project down the line. It ensures that opportunities are earned through demonstrated profitable performance, not simply granted as a massive high-risk chance that could bankrupt a small country.
It allows for creative freedom without existential financial threat.
The studio can afford the occasional swing and a miss at 50. They can't at 300.
Finally, we arrive at a really radical proposal for generating more consistently marketable content, something the sources call a call for audience-driven green.
This one is fascinating.
Since theaters are struggling and studios are constantly guessing wrong about what the audience wants, the sources suggest treating the greenlighting process less like an internal executive decision
and more like a Kickstarter or a sophisticated focus.
The idea is revolutionary because it bypasses the isolated executive suite. Instead of relying purely on internal development and boardroom mandates, studios should actively consult the people who are directly impacted by this crisis.
The theater owners, dedicated cinema goers, or even online experts like specific highly followed YouTube channels and film commentators who frequently call correctly what will perform well theatrically.
Why are theater owners so essential to this equation?
Because the studios might feel they can survive a theatrical flop by selling the film digitally or streaming it eventually. But the theater owners desperately need consistent, marketable content to pay the rent right now. They are the financial canary in the coal.
So the proposal is for studio development heads to literally sit down with them
And ask, we have the budget to greenlight 4 or 5 lower budget movies in this risk-mitigated bracket. Based on what you see selling tickets and filling seats in your local markets, what kinds of movies are your local audiences actually willing to commit dollars to see in the theater rather than waiting for streaming?
It's replacing guesswork with committed and seeking out those online experts. The sources mention specific film commentators who have demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict box office trends based on audience sentiment. That adds a layer of external, real-time market data that traditional market research often misses.
If you poll what the audience wants, whether it's a specific sequel, a new genre, or a certain kind of story, and you execute it well, the likelihood of commitment and attendance goes way, way up.
The sources argue that if Hollywood focuses its energy on making the best movies they can make and executing new ideas in a way that is profitable, the audience will show up,
regardless of budget size or specific creative frame.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? The core takeaway is that the current crisis is largely self-inflicted. It's not just a lingering post-pandemic malaise.
No, it's a direct consequence of years of poor executive decisions, bloated budget, and prioritizing narrow agendas over consistent audience trust and storytelling quality.
The financial instability is now forcing Hollywood into a painful but necessary period of self-correction. It's forcing them to be smarter, leaner, and ruthlessly focused on what audiences truly want to spend money on.
It's a high-stakes moment where the entire creative and financial model is on trial. The future of film will be decided by whether executives choose to continue gambling on a few $300 million flops, or if they adopt strategies of diversified risk and audience-driven.
So let's summarize our deep dive into Hollywood's crossroads. We've seen that the projected 2026 Hollywood recession is driven by a two-pronged crisis: overwhelming financial instability defined by colossal budgets and broken franchise,
and a subsequent creative and talent crisis evidenced by that steep reactionary drop in women directors to 8.1% of the top grossing films, fueled by a studio backlash against financial risk.
The path forward, as proposed by the analysis, requires radical risk mitigation, betting smaller on numerous $50 to $75 million projects rather than bigger on just one, and crucially, treating the audience and the theatrical partners as consultants in the greenlighting process.
This crisis forces Hollywood to reconsider its entire operating model, and those decisions will ultimately dictate the quality, variety, and availability of every film you see or don't see in the coming.
And here's where it gets really interesting, something for you to mull over as you navigate the new theatrical landscape. The sources noted that theaters are increasingly relying on reruns of universally beloved old movies, films like Lord of the Rings and Labyrinth, to fill seats in 2026. This raises a crucial question about the future of film investment. If audiences are happy to pay premium dollar to see decades-old classics on the big screen films that were universally loved and respected precisely because they prioritize craft and timeless storytelling, does the industry's future lie more in honoring established legacy and prioritizing genuinely high-quality, crowd-pleasing filmmaking, regardless of budget size or novelty, than in chasing those new, risk-laden, $500 million blocks?
It's a great question.
Perhaps the answer to solvency is simply better movies, not bigger bets.